bustling. They were in the Bronx in New York at Louisville College in the early 70s, and I hadn't really experienced an office that reminded me of that college environment until I got to High Times. It was a lot of fun, a lot of people enjoying themselves, 2 people to an office, crowded, just hustling and bustling. It was a small place, putting out a lot of energy. And I was, after doing a little bit of freelancing work, I was offered the opportunity to be news editor of High Times, which is a little bit of a switch for me, since I mostly focused on entertainment. I'd written a book about video games, I'd written a book about basketball. I'd never focused on marijuana as a subject to write about. Matter of fact, I hadn't even read High Times very often. I was a student of the new journalism of the 70s, the Village Voice, Rolling Stone, New Times, and all the great new journalist writers, Tom Wolfe, Capote, Mailer, and everybody else. And I sort of fed myself in the New York Times, and she is a therapist, I think, a psychiatrist who never writes for the Wall Street Journal, very, very supportive of the drug war. And it was a stunning revelation, once again, to realize that her statements were illogical, they didn't follow, and it raised all kinds of, as the libertarians we said, straw men, accusing me of advocating, crack vending machines in the school lunchroom, and nowhere was there any, in other words, she was just inventing things that I had said, and yet, for instance, it was on Salon magazine. On the internet, you could click back and see what I had said and so forth. So I retired from the field and said she was no longer interested in carrying on this dialogue. The other problem is, of course, what Dick just mentioned here. Barry McCaffrey just makes it up. Yeah. How do you defeat somebody who says to you, and I was on that debate in City event, which just before he further information in there. And in the Los Angeles Times, we basically chased the prohibitions off the field. There are no more letters in the Los Angeles Times in favor of drug prohibition. Every time, whenever it happens, or rare occasions, there will be 6 or 8 or 10 responses, and it all comes from, I recognize many of the names, in fact. It comes from the energy from these internet sites.
And by the way, A. Rosenthal, 40.
Theft, and they open the show and list their top stories, and instantly, as they go on the air, every head in the control room turns to the consoles over here that show the competition. And fortunately for these people, the other 3 channels in LA open their news show with the same story, and they all breathed a sigh of relief that they had hit, that they had not embarrassed themselves by picking the wrong story to lead with, that they were in sync with ABC and CBS on this. So, and I think we are cracking through it. I think, once again, I think the internet has a lot.
People on both the left and the right think that if you leave moral decisions to the individual, you must think they're unimportant, since you're not making a collective decision about them. But that's wrong. It's backwards. It's because these decisions are important that they have to be left up to the individual conscience. If what we were talking about was choosing the right fork, then there'd be no reason not to have central direction. Who cares? Choosing the right fork. But we're not talking about choosing the right fork. We're talking about choosing what to believe and whom to love and how to treat our friends and our children, and what to achieve, and what to create, and where to live, and what to do for a living, and how, and where, and with whom. And those are decisions that are important, which is why they need to be made by individuals. Now, I don't have to tell you too much about some of the right-wing views of whether people should be able to make these choices, but I want to point to a couple of prominent people who are not right-wingers. What are the consequences of our unlibertarian marijuana laws? Well, the drug laws break up families. That's supposed to be an important concern of ours these days. Too many parents have been separated from their children because they were convicted of marijuana possession, small-scale sale of drugs, or some other non-violent offense. I talked earlier about some people who are victims of unjust power. Talk about Will Foster. He used marijuana to control the pain and swelling associated with his rheumatoid arthritis. He was arrested, convicted of marijuana cultivation, and sentenced to 93 years in prison. Later, very generously reduced to 20 years in prison. He's got 3 children. Are those children better off with a father who uses marijuana medicinally, or a father they're not going to see for 20 years because he's in prison? And going to jail for drug offenses isn't just for men anymore. In 1996, almost 200,000 women were arrested for violating drug laws. Now, most of them didn't go to jail, of course, but...
Yes, you may retort, but that's the problem. Pot smokers lose their motivation. No, they don't. 2 former dabblers in weed are now the governors, respectively, of Minnesota and New Mexico. One is the laconic, eloquent presidential hopeful Bill Bradley. Canadian snowboarder Ross Rebagliati won an Olympic gold medal. The Grateful Dead became one of the highest grossing concert acts of all time. And everybody I've ever met who smokes pot now and then, ranging from high-paid scientists to award-winning winners, carries on pro forma. Pot is like alcohol. People undone by it usually are trying to undo themselves because something in their lives is too painful or too scary to confront soberly. The same is true of overeating, workaholism, abusing painkillers, and gobbling tranquilizers. This difference between self-abuse and recreational pot smoking is so widely and tacitly understood that the only people who miss the point are the pundits and experts who shout that pot is just one step down the road to heroin, crack cocaine, and death. Every
phenomenon is based in fear. It is a psychological fear of admitting having been wrong in supporting the drug war. I find that admitting having been wrong is a frightening thing for many people. It is hard for people to consider themselves intelligent and to admit that they have been bamboozled. The racist classist effects of the war on drugs are becoming more and more clear. We see it simply by looking at the faces in prison. It's a virtual sea of young black and brown-skinned men and women. But there is one central theme here. They are overwhelmingly of the same socioeconomic class. The black people I talk to often say that we have to end racism first and then consider drug policy. It is deep-seated habitual actions on the part of both the oppressor and the oppressed. It was passive racism by politicians who thump their chest and proclaim that they are saving white children, while in the deep recesses of their minds, they harbor an image of a black man as a criminal. Minorities and whites need to think about the problem from a little different perspective. They have got to understand that the problem is classism and not so much racism. I see time and time again, blacks and whites with the wherewithal get off, while those with lesser means do the hard time. I spent a year substitute teaching in inner-city Hartford schools just to get a feel from the children how the drug war affects them.
You get to see for yourself that they actually do all of that. So Mark Mauer is a brilliant man. And I say that with no exaggeration. He's a brilliant man. I've been fortunate enough to hear him speak on a number of different occasions, and I'm always blown away by the wealth of information that he provides to people and the straightforward way in which he does it. That's a definite skill. Obviously, he's not a lawyer. We all learned that.
She said that, not me.
Anyway, Mark is the Assistant Director of the Sentencing Project, which is based right here in Washington, D.C. And for those of you who've been involved in doing work around drug policy, the Sentencing Project is well known to all of you because it's the place that we all go when we need to get some quick statistics, when we want to have factual information, when we want to talk about what's happening right now in the criminal justice system.
About the racial disparities that we see in the system. Back in 1980, African Americans represented about 21% of the people arrested for drug possession offenses. Today, those figures are about 35% or so. Now, we know from government surveys that African Americans constitute about 15% of drug users nationally, yet 35% of the people arrested for possessing drugs. So clearly we have some kind of disconnect there. Something's going on. A black drug user is more likely to get arrested than a white drug user. Well, what happens with people selling drugs? A lot of the politicians will say, well, yeah, but a lot of the serious things we're going after are drug sales, and it may be that drug sales in minority neighborhoods are much higher, and that's why you see such high disproportions of blacks and Latinos getting arrested for drug selling. Well, we don't know enough about drug selling. You can't do random surveys the same way you can about drug use itself.